move apart and sit 6 feet away if you want. We can, that might be considered safe protocol now. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ari Martinez, who is joining us from Cal State Long Beach, where he is a recently arrived assistant professor after having previously been at San Francisco State University. Before that, a number of other places. He received his PhD at the University of Florida and is the product of UCSB. So he is a UC product. Ari's work is fascinating. It is, how other species listen to other species. So this is sort of an Amazonian bird version of Dr. Dolittle. And with that, I will let Ari scare us with this fabulous work in interspecific communication.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Thanks again for having me. I've had some really cool interactions with some graduate students and their faculty and some stuff that I've been interested in looking at competitive behavior and talking to folks at Dan's lab. Looking forward to talking to some other folks. It's always so exciting to exchange ideas and come to know another campus. And today what I'd like to do is talk about three different themes based upon natural history within the system that I will eventually get to. But I'm really interested in, I was informally learned about behavioral ecology as a grad student. So I'm really interested in looking at how behavioral mechanisms mainly through social information, can influence individual decision making, and I'd like to try and eventually see how that can help draw some inference about community level pattern. So I'm kind of dipping into the worlds a little bit of behavioral ecology and community ecology. So with that said, I'd like to do a little experiment. Now, this is the main assumption for this is that I want you to imagine this is a COVID-19 free world where there's no virus in the world when I'm doing this. Okay, so I want you to imagine you're going to Italy. Okay, and so you're going to a conference, and so you have a chance to get out to break out from a session, and you want to get a cappuccino because you're in Italy, right? So you got to get a cappuccino. So I want you to think you find these two little cafes. Raise your hand if you want to go to the place on your left. This is a virus-free representation. now raise your hand if you're going to the place on your right. Okay, great. That's usually the response. But both rooms, there's no wrong answer, right? The idea here, of course, is that if you go to the place, if you had said the place on the left, you would have said, well, there's no one there, so I'm going to get a cappuccino really quick, not really realizing that the service is really bad in Italy. But on the other hand, you might go to the place on your right where you say, look, all the Italians are going to this place, so this is where I'm going to get a good cappuccino, and so that's where I'm going to go. So what you're doing is you're cueing into what people who have a common interest, common resource are doing. And so the idea here is that this is social information that's being inadvertently advertised. And we know that a lot of species do that with conspecifics. Clearly, we have people here who study that, right? And of course, we know that animals do that across species. So we know there's heterospecific information in all types of forms that are advertised. And of course, if you're in the Serengeti and you see an animal that shares a common mammal, they all have need for water on Serengeti. If an animal, like an elephant, is down and clouded away and has its nose in the ground, you obviously can be either feeding or going for water, and as a consequence, you might be attracted to that same resource just by the inadvertent advertising what that animal is doing. Now, one type of information, the type of group. The groups are really important here in terms of thinking about information, how it's shared, and we know that groups are really ubiquitous all over the planet, both conspecific and heterospecifics. And here we have an example again. You can have different types of gazelles that co-occur together. You can have zebras and giraffes, all different combinations, and obviously it's because there's something in common about some kind of resource, information you're gleaning about some resources, either food or predators. Likewise, you might have the same situation for shoals of coral reef fish. And many of you might have seen that, where fish are queuing into where other fish are feeding. If any of you off the coast of California have broken up an urchin, you might see some type of fish come in, perch come in, another kind of species comes in. So animals might be queuing into each other in what they're doing. And of course, birds off the California coast, you have foraging aggregations where if there's mackerel or anchovy off the coasts and marine systems, species can be attracted to each other and form this aggregation. So when these have all these animals co-occurring in space and time, you have this high concentration and therefore potential for signals or communication to be used from one species to another. So in a way, there's a good way to look at these different species, these types of communication as a way of looking at species interactions. So I want to talk to you about mixed species flocks and model system for doing this, looking at how social information is shared amongst different species, and the consequences for it from the behavioral point of view, and how that might have some consequences at the level of the community. And then on top of that, I have this real focus on urban natural history, and I think it's really important to go out there and make really detailed observations. I think it sounds like it's obvious, but you can glean from, because the flocks I'm talking about in the Amazon, really diverse, they have these really interesting behaviors and natural history, life history strategies that can really give you some interesting ideas about types of questions we can answer in terms of behavior in communities. So with that said, I want to talk about these flocks, these Amazonian flocks as a model system. This will be the first part of my talk. And then the second part will be the assembly of species and flocks. In other words, what are the species that get attracted to the flock? What are their traits that tell you, that may determine what kinds of species are in flocks and the consequences associated with species from different flocks. And then lastly, the flock in the larger forest and what it means to be in a flock in terms of being in the community in a rainforest. So with that said, we want to meet the flockers, and we want to go all over South America and talk about these characters here. And that's the first point, is that they are all over. In other words, wherever you are in Amazonia, whether it's in Brazil or Peru or Bolivia, you have this same system. You have allospecies replacements, but essentially wherever you go, you have this same system of species. So it's a very broad range of where you see this phenomenon. And so there's a lot of potential to study variants of it, and it has some variants on questions you might have. And what you essentially have are these groups of co-occurring species that are very currently and tightly associated together. You have these birds that are called ant wrens and otherbirds, and these other birds called antrites. We know that these birds provide alarm calls, and these species take advantage of them. And there's some evidence, depending on what the alarm caller is, the species, sometimes they take advantage of insects from other birds, and sometimes not. So what's really an important point to emphasize is that they call this these nuclear species, for lack of a better term. And we're going to use these orange squares to designate these species that are constantly co-occurring together. In other words, we have a pair of individuals per species. This isn't like juncos or chickadees where you see flocks of 15 to 10 to 20. You literally have a pair, and sometimes, usually you have 1 or 2 offspring at some time of the year. And then what's bizarre about it is that they tend to share or co-occur in this territory year-round. They literally wake up in the same spot, and these birds travel together the whole day, and then they roost and go to and they settle down for the night. So that wherever you are in a plot, this is a 100-hectare plot from French Guiana, from Julien and Toulet, and you have, back in the 90s, they actually determined all these different home ranges of these flocks, about 4 to 6 hectares. And in each of these, you have the exact same repeated units of these permanent co-occurring birds as they go around their territory. And these black dots represent these roosting sites where they literally, you go to a spot, they will wake up there every morning, and then at the end of the day, they'll settle down for the night. And you will have that same process with each of these flocks. And what you notice here is that when you're thinking of the abundance, rarity, distribution of species in a forest, these are some of the most abundant birds. In other words, wherever you go in the Amazon, you're going to be on someone's territory. You're going to go on flock territory. So it is completely saturated. There's no unused real estate. So it's kind of like, so it's kind of like Westwood, same type of thing. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that like territorial birds, when territory birds hear, one sings against another one to defend its territory. But what happens here is when this flock comes across this flock, you'll have one species sing against its conspecific in the other flock. You'll have the other species sing against its conspecific, and then a third species sing against its conspecific. Essentially what you have is a cacophony of noise as all these species are fighting against their equivalent conspecific in the other flock. And it's crazy, it's really interesting to see. So it's kind of like an Amazonian version of West Side Story with the sharks and the jets. Now it's probably lost on the younger demographic, but they're doing a remake, so in a year that'll be more relevant. And the interesting thing, of course, is that these species, they co-occur together, and one of the things is that they're not competing for food. We know that they don't because they have different foraging strategies. And that foraging strategy is a combination of the maneuvers and the substrates. And what I mean by that is the maneuver is the way the species is feeding. So species that kind of tend to hop around and are plucking things off the substrate, that's called gleaning. And then Sally hover down here, for instance, are birds that actually sally out into the air and catch something. So we quantify these different proportions of times that they do these different maneuvers, and we combine that, of course, with the substrate. So in other words, birds can, maybe a lot of birds glean, but the substrates may be different. So this species does mostly gleaning, this ant right here, but it's specializing on dead leaves. This species is gleaning, but it's specializing in green leaves. And then this species is kind of doing these sally maneuvers a lot more, even though it's the same substrate as this one. So in a sense, when you combine these different things, you get these foraging ecologies that really explains why these birds can permanently travel together in a group and they're not really taking advantage of food resources together. The next thing to realize is that a lot of other species will join this group as they move in throughout their territory. So you can have these 3 species come and go early in the morning, and then another 2 hours later, these 2 species come and go, and then these other species come. And so it's essentially you have these facultative species that join these flocks such that if you go and follow this flock throughout the entire day, you follow throughout the entire day, it's like a mean and 95% circumference interval of the number of species. You see it kind of fluctuates, but it never goes beneath a set number of those core species. And then throughout the day, if you were to follow and sum up all the species, you can have anywhere between 50 and 60 species joining this flock throughout the day. And you get this process wherever you are in the Amazon. So you can, wherever you are in inundated forests or upland forests, you see the same pattern. A little bit of variation different, but you can see where that goes. Now the question is, you have these groups, well, what's crazy is to think, well, I've talked a little bit about some of these components of permanency, but how permanent are they? And I want to talk about that both from a spatial and temporal perspective. Here is this is the original map that I showed you from Julian and Tule, where we went out there to do some of the work we're going to talk about in the second part of this talk. And we noted, here were these original, the grid. This is a 100-hectare study grid. And here are the original polygons with the roosting sites. And I talked to Juan Pablo, my collaborator, and I said, wouldn't it be crazy? Like, where are we going to find these things? We're going to go out to the same place. Wouldn't it be crazy if it was the same? And sure enough, you go out and we map the polygons we found with the roosting sites. And we found that they were pretty much, the overlap in terms of their spatial distribution is very similar. In a sense, what it shows is after 20 years, they're in the same spot. And what that says is that the original birds were banded. These birds were not, so it's different generations. So what's saying is that the characteristics of the flock are outliving the individual birds that join the flock. So it's pretty crazy. And from a temporal point of view, look at the species composition. The only thing I want you to realize here is that here's the proportion of time that each of these bars is species. It's the proportion of time that a species is present on these flocks. These are these permanent flocking species, and what you can see is that from those time periods, that those same core groups of species. Sure, question?
Sorry, are you measuring the territories by observation where the bird is?
Yeah, we follow them around. Okay. Yeah. And the flocks, so the upshot here is that these flocks are really temporally spatially stable through time, and so this is an incredibly interesting pattern that makes them very useful for study, and it begs some other questions in terms of what determines who's in these flocks. And so the first part of that question is, what I want to get to is talking about what functional traits explain reliance on social information. And to talk about that, I mentioned it before, one of the things we're going to be talking about is eavesdropping, alarm calling. And I say eavesdropping because eavesdropping is a specific type of information, because in the communication literature, people can be very particular about what is a signal, what is a cue. And eavesdropping is essentially, if I talk to this person here, I have information that I'm the producer, this is the receiver. This individual is listening in on that information. It's not intended for that person, but of course they're listening anyway. So our definition is individuals that use information intended for another receiver, in addition, obviously, to the receivers themselves. And so this is from peak 2005. Incidentally, so eavesdropping came from 16th century England. So you had the eaves of the house that came over the roof, and this was the eavesdrop where the water dropped off, and if a person was listening in on the conversation, that was the eavesdrop. So if you get nothing else from this talk, you got that in your pocket for your next party. Okay? So the thing is, though, is that of course, well, one of the things I want to do is talk about eavesdropping in terms of costs and benefits, and we're going to think more in terms from the cost and the benefit side of view. But what we can think about is, what I want people to, what I want to emphasize is distance from the source of the information. And in that sense, what we can think about is that the potential value of the information is obviously going to be very close to the source, because if you're both sharing the resource, that information is very relevant. If Felipe alarm calls, I'm right next to him, and we both share a predator, that's very relevant information. However, if I'm eating falafel down in Westwood and the alarm calls, that's not really relevant, because obviously I'm not in the same context. So as we get far from this, as we increase distance from the source, the information becomes less relevant. And of course, we can think of the flip side is, if I'm going to try and eavesdrop on that source of information and we share resources, we would expect that the competition for other resources might limit how often, how long I can stay close by, and there will be some negative cost to doing so. And what we want to do is have this be in this area where the potential value of information exceeds the cost of being around in that group, or named next to the source, and that will be the net information value. So for the purposes of what I'm going to talk about here, though, I want to talk about the potential value of this information, because what we can think about, what are the traits that influence the way the traits that influence how potential value might vary as a function of distance from the source. And so I have to show the gratuitous species diversity alive in the Amazon. Here are some of the birds we've caught. And of course, what you might notice is that you have all these different species of different plumages, different bill sizes, and different body sizes, which maybe you can't see from here. But the idea is, of course, they vary in a lot of different ways in terms of their traits. And so here we collaborated with Juan Pablo Gomez and Jose Miguel Ponciano to actually look at how some of these different traits influence reliance on social information bought through alarm calling. And here are these different types of traits that we're looking at. We have body size, how birds respond. We expect that birds that are close in body size to the alarm caller might be the ones that respond more. And then foraging height, there's some hypotheses that suggest that this, like when you walk through a rainforest, it's these areas up to where the roof is. These are the most vulnerable parts because it's somewhat visible but not completely visible. So those are there's the foraging heights where you'd expect things to maybe be more vulnerable. You have distance from the alarm source, of course, and then you have a foraging strategy, which I alluded to before. And this is important because if you're myopic and you're gleaning, if you're gleaning off of a leaf, you're not looking around. So you might really be relying on someone else's information. If you're a flycatcher and you're flying out and you're coming back, you're doubling up on the cost of looking for something while actually being aware of predators. So you may not be as reliant on that information. And then, of course, we control for phylogeny and look for phylogenetic signal in that, and to see if that was a factor. So we did these playback trials where we looked at alarm calls, and we did about 300 trials. We basically went on the forest scaring them, trying to scare birds, and measuring the response to the playback, and we tried to see what functional traits explain that response. It's really important here to distinguish that if you're a birder in North America, when you think of alarm calls for birds, people are typically thinking mommy calls. These are not mommy calls. This is more like the alarm call, like for Mars to get out of the way, we're going to die. That's what it is, right? And to give you a sense for that, here is an example of one of our trials. This is actually a bird. Yes, this is my National Geographic. I'm just kidding. My National Geographic quality video. It was terrible. So here we go. This is an example of an alarm call. So what I want you to see is you'll see what this bird does right here. Boom. Right, dives down. So that diving down is clearly the response. However, they also do other things. They can freeze, or they can dive in different directions. So with the bird freeze or dives is a really positive response, and sometimes you can do an alarm and the bird will freeze and it'll literally stay frozen for like 2 or 3 minutes. You're seeing it with the binoculars, only like 55 minutes. And it's just for the time. But it's amazing the variance in response. And so no one's even, that's a whole other area of research that hasn't really been tapped, looking at how what kinds of responses these birds are making under what conditions. So the upshot is this, here I'm showing you a graph from the model predictions based upon our analyses, and the main thing to get from this is that these gleaning birds and these bark gleaning birds were the ones that responded most. These results have been back transformed, so that's why I put that one. And anyway, what the main thing is to show that these birds, in fact, these myopic birds are the ones that respond the most. And when we look, there isn't really any phylogenetic signal in terms of what birds are responding to alarm calls. However, what is interesting is you get birds, that is interesting in the sense that birds all throughout the phylogeny are responding to alarm calls, which says that it's really valuable for a lot of species throughout the forest, whether they're in a flock or not. Do you get to be in a flock, or are you constrained to be in a flock? Kind of thinking about it those ways. And then, of course, the birds, we do see that the birds that are here, a lot of these dark triangles are in fact birds that are in flocks, that are permanently in flocks. So, in essence, what we're seeing is that if you're a gleaner or a flycatcher, in other words, the foraging strategy is what really might determine the potential value of that information more than some of these other functional traits, according to this result. So I've talked about, this was talking about what kinds of species then might be in a flock. If all else being equal, we think predators are reasonably right? So kind of making, so if you're looking at species pool, you might predict that species that have this foraging strategy are the species that we would expect in flocks. But we can go to the flip side and say, what are the consequences of associating with certain species in a flock, given variance in the types of information they might provide? And in this sense, we're going to look at that by going to another field site. This is southeastern Peru, and this is this is again where we have a bunch of flocks. But here's an interesting variant: is that with these flocks, all these groups here, each of these is a flock of kernel density estimation of a flock about 3 to 5 hectares. And what you have here is this red dot represents, you have red dots and blue dots, you see they're interspersed. When it says that these flocks are all the same except for the sentinel, the alarm calling bird. They're here in this system, you have two sentinels in the same genus, but they separate up a little bit by habitat. So in a sense, they're habitat specialists while everyone around them is a generalist. But those other generalists are either in this flock or in that flock, you don't go between them. So there's a lot more flexibility with these other alarm calling birds. So you've got this species here, which is the Anomalies arzacis, with its flock, and then you've got this other Strateginus, or the bluish slate and the dusky-throated edge-shrike. And here's a spectrogram of the alarm call. So a spectrogram, of course, many of you know, is a visualization of the vocalization. It's the frequency of the sound wave, right, as a function of time. And again, what we're going to do is compare and contrast these two groups. So what this means, what we're looking at here is, if you're one of these birds, it might be very different whether, given the information that this species provides versus this one. So what are the consequences of that, if there are any? And we can look at that and get just to reinforce here that you've got these species in that flock. The reds are the bluish slate, and then the dusky throat are the blue. So blue and red are two different flocks led by different sentinels. And we did a break-curse analysis of this just to show that we did a comparison, and essentially the species are essentially the same except for that alarm calling bird. Okay, so the communities are very identical except for that alarm calling bird. And to test that, what we did is we teamed up with a raptor, and then a former graduate student, and my advisor, former postdoc advisor, Vance Friedberg, Alicia Ibarra, and Luis Fernando Collado. Luis Fernando Collado, he's a raptor, he owns his own business in Peru, and he's amazing. He never went past, he graduated from high school, didn't go to college. He's a brilliant falconer. Right? It was just to see the way he worked with the birds and worked with us was really special. It was one of the folks, Eric, who worked with him, and what we did is we had 3 live raptors. We had a bicolored hawk, we had a Harris hawk, and then an African or a falcon. We wanted to then see is how these birds responded differently to these. So in essence, what we're doing is looking at these kinds of, looking at how context, so a little bit of looking at the referential graded information to see if that might vary. In other words, we have these 3 predator types, and if we see if there's different types of alarm signals between these 3, then we say they're really distinguishing between these different predator types. But more likely, what we thought was this scenario here, is that you might see that these 2 smaller predators, they might respond equally, and then if they respond equally to this versus this one, then it's probably a body size thing, which makes sense. These are ambush predators. As this thing's flying through at top speed, you're not like, well, I think the primaries are black, and I think there's a rufous rump. You got it. It's there or it's not. So you got to err on it. You have to make a really quick decision. So it would make sense that they're not, unless you're being very particular about some subtleties about differences in species. And then lastly, of course, with predator distance, which would be a proxy for, do they have different alarm signals for graded threat or the magnitude of the threat? And so, in a sense, by doing those 2 things together, we can then look at, are these birds producing the same kinds of information, these different sentinels, or is there variation in their ability to detect predators and the types of signals they produce? And so here is an example from one of these trials. We have 3 individuals. This person here has the parabolic mic. This is our Home Depot version from our Lonely Planet budget. Here is the person keying on an alarm calling bird. And then this person here, once this person has the bird in sight, this person is going to direct this person to fly the raptor in a certain direction depending on the randomized treatment that we decided. And it looks like this, which obviously doesn't go to plan, right, always. So here's an example. So you can hear those alarms in the background. Now a lot of these birds, you can't do this in a hide, obviously, and the bird starts, the screeching you heard was the actual Harris hawk. So I'm not a sadist, these birds are not eating, it would actually not be very convenient if they took out our birds. So they've been raised in captivity, and so the screeching here at the end is once they perch, they're asking for food, and then when you come back, the falconer gives them food. So you heard the alarm calls in there, and what we could do then is do we did a factorial, semi-factorial experiment here where we had three different body sizes, 3 different kinds of distances going right at it, like an angle to kind of measure how close they flew on average to the bird, roughly, and then we had that for both types of species. So we have 3 predators, 3 distances, and then a control where we threw a stick. So looking at this then with these results, what I want to show is here we've got this is from the models, the model predictions, and what I want people to focus on here, here's proportion of response to the alarm call for the dusky throated ranch shrike. And what I want people to see is that on average, these are the model predictions, these lines here, and what you see is that these guys to here are just falling out, they're almost identical, and they're distinguished from this line here, which is the large predator, which says they're producing alarm calls with smaller predators. The smaller predators are more of a threat because they're more agile, they're able to take them out, which is consistent with what you folks found here in temperate regions. Then of course here's the other antrect, which has the same pattern. However, what you might notice is that they're producing alarm calls on average much more so than the dusky throat. Okay. So all else being equal, it seems like that would be the better place to be. However, when you're looking at this, so we know that the production of these alarm calls aren't equal. The way we'll also say there was some information for graded threat produced on the number of urgent notes, where closer distances tend to have urgent notes. Now, this says from the point of view of what they produced, but how is it responded to? So they did an experiment, playback experiment, using all those alarm calls back to those same birds. And what he found mostly was, in fact, they responded more to the bird that produced, seemed like a detected alarm calls more readily, which suggests that the information value that might differ between those species and might be recognized by other species. So all else being equal, then you have, in a sense, if everything else is the same, on what you have is variation in the information landscape about predators. And it also says that as functional traits go, that when we're thinking about the net value of information, that the type of information produced might influence how that's going to be, that's going to influence the overall value to other specifics as well. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about, the last section I want to talk about is what does this mean then for the birds in these flocks in terms of in the forest? And so I want to ask this question: is how does reliance on social information influence the realized niche? And to do that, I think it's really interesting because here's where we can kind of unify two different types of literature that are very prolific. One is, of course, for those of you who might deal with community ecology straight up, or non-consumptive effects. And we all know about the examples of Yellowstone where wolves have been reintroduced, and so ungulates end up shifting their distribution, and then depending on whose data you believe or interpretation, there's cascading effects. However, we see that in a lot of systems, and I want to give love to the insect world, right? Because we talked about wolves, but also we find that to the other extreme. Scott Cooper, back in the 80s, did these same kind of experiments with trout, showing that in fact, you put trout in a creek, you can alter the distribution of water striders, these gerrids, on the creek, right? They'll shift to the sides of the ponds where there's trout present, and then they'll come back into the middle of the pond when they're not present. So in other words, it's shifting where they're going as well. So we have lots of examples all across different taxa about how predation risk influences prey behavior and the distribution of species in space. Now, parallel to that is, in fact, this sense that eavesdropping is widespread, and we know that from lots of systems across lots of species, and not only across species, but across taxonomic groups. So Cheney and Seafarth has gone back to the 80s, where they've seen that different types of hornbills will distinguish between alarm calls of different types of vertebrate monkeys. We have across species of birds, which there's tons of examples now, both here in Europe and in South America, and in Indonesia, and Southeast Asia. And of course, we've got a lot of examples in Africa now, and there's a lot of papers coming out from Africa looking at these dynamics of these dropping of these species. So here we have this non-consumptive effects, and how are animals evaluating risk and shifting their behaviors. And then we have, on the other hand, how are animals using social information for their animals. So in a sense, we could start thinking about how to combine these and say, well, how are species using information from other species to mediate their risk from predators? And that's where we want to go with this idea that, in fact, if you think about a resource gradient and realized niche, you might expect that species that provide social information might, in fact, influence the use of a resource, where this might be like % cover. And you might expect that where you don't have this species, the other species might shift where they go as a result of not having other species mediate social information. And we work here. I worked to bring another character into the group. Oliver Mielkind did field work with me, and I was a PhD student at Berkeley, and he did some of the KD estimation on this, and worked with some of the other folks I mentioned. And here, prediction would be that one is the behavioral prediction. If that information is really valuable, then there's just the idea that that flock is not as beneficial to be in, and so you have lower tendency to flock. And then, of course, the other one is going to be this altered home range behavior would reflect a higher vegetation cover, and that would be the sense that you don't have this species anymore that's mediating social information, so risky habitat to be in, And as a result of it being a risky habitat, you're going to shift where you go in the forest. And the reason for that, again, I just want to reiterate, is that in the forest, people have hypothesized that the understory area where you don't have a lot of vegetation is what might be riskiest, and therefore having species that mediate information might allow the coexistence of these species in that part of the forest. So kind of looking at one of these mechanisms that might explain why we have some species in certain parts of the forest. So we have 8 flocks that we picked in the same site in Panticoy in southeastern Peru. And what we did is we picked 8 flocks, we ran this side 4 controls and 4 treatments. And what we did is we removed that alarm calling bird, and we followed the flock for 3 days, did GPS, followed where they were, we quantified really roughly the vegetation and the vertical profile. And then what we did is we removed the pair of alarm calling birds. Now remember, it's not 15, right? It's 2 to 3 individuals, maybe 4. We removed those for 3 days, and then we monitored their behaviors afterwards to measure those same things after 3 days in the post. And then for the control, we capture the birds and then we let them go, okay? And what I'm showing here for these models, this is the net change here. These are all the different species that are in the flock, typically, when we follow them around. And here I want to show the net change in the proportion of flocking occurrence. And what that means is, we've summed up all the time in these census intervals that the birds were in the pre-census, all the times they are in the flock in the post. And so if the change is positive, that means they increased the amount of time they're in the flock from pre to post. And if it was negative, it means it decreased in time from pre to post. Okay? And what we show from the model predictions again is, now this is just fixed effects plotting, that's why it looks all neat with error bars, but the idea, the main thing I want to show is that 2 things. You have here these gray, these little removal flocks, and what you can see on average, they decrease the proportion of time they were in the flocks. But notice that if the flock, it wasn't skies falling, they completely fall apart. Would suggest there's other advantages, classic, and there might be some other classic mechanisms for being in a group that might explain why you're together. We no longer have someone who has social information, but hell, it's better that we're together because maybe you're going to get eaten, maybe not, right? Typical kind of dilution effect type of thing. And then, conversely, so that's the main thing to see, and then also that it was only done for 3 days, so we don't know what the longer term effects are. And the second thing is where do they go? Here's a kernel density estimate. The blue is the pre. So all this blue area is about 3 hectares. That's about their home range on average. And these are where we follow the flocks before removal. And then the red, we capture the birds, let them go. Here's where they follow in the post. And then here's what they did in one of the removals. They completely shifted where they went. Now, along the lines with this, don't have this, but we did quantify also the vegetation, and what we see is the vegetation profile tends to be denser, lower than higher up. I don't know if I can show that graph right now, but on average, the profile of the forest it's more tangly and it's more unpleasant to be in. Typically, when you're following them, this is how you can. This is the personal experience. And what we think then that there is some evidence here then that if you remove this alarm calling bird, it does kind of shift where the birds go in the forest, and therefore has potential to influence the resources that they use. And so we see that there are some examples for this realized niche. And so in conclusion from these three different types of lines that I've talked about today of information, what we can see is there's these stocks are really stable in space and time, and I think it's really important to realize that flocks are on a continuum. There's ones that are very loosely organized, so that's a whole other thing to think about. But on this really stable end of the continuum, it allows us to ask some really interesting questions about why various traits of eavesdroppers, might explain who's in the flock, and secondly, that variations in alarm calling birds, right, may have some potential fitness consequences for the other species in the flock, all else being equal. And then lastly, there's maybe some consequences for eavesdropping on a realized interest species in that group. And so I just want to talk just really briefly about a future direction. So I've talked a little bit about interspecific eavesdropping between the different types of birds and who's eavesdropping on who. And here, for example, as we know, this is a satellite tamarin. It's a small little primate, about this big. And we know that they have shared predators. Here's the alarm signal, and you can see that the alarm signal, interestingly, this is waiting to happen. We could look at a meta-analysis to look at what alarm signals look like. They're all having these stuttering staccato notes. Notice that it's all within 1.5 seconds to 2 seconds. And so this is what they look like. They're cute when they look like that, but not when they're stealing your bananas. And so here's an example of an alarm call. I want you, same to that alarm calling antrite. Here's the primate. Just take a look at this. See it for yourselves. Boom. Okay, that was the primate responding to the bird alarm call. And what we know is that a lot of species do that, right? Here's some of the data that we're trying to get published now. And so the tamarins essentially respond equally to the birds as they do to their own conspecific alarm calls. And so what this says is, well, who knew? In other words, there's a lot of species, when we did these trials, a lot of data that we haven't showed you that we're working on, is in fact, a lot of species, these are alarm calls from all these different species that we generated throughout these trials. What I've talked to you about first was that the birds freeze or die. That's kind of like the first level of response. But if you're not in that area where imminent death isn't a factor, all these other birds are giving these alarm calls. So looking at these eavesdropping networks is the next stage of the game. And because we know that we have a bunch of different species, we have alarm calls from all these different species, we can now see what are the functional traits that might explain the relative importance of different species to these community-wide eavesdropping networks. So that's one way we're going, and so we're going to hopefully get some movement on that. And then secondly, working with some folks in Panama, we've done some parallel work where we're looking at foraging aggregations in ant swarms of birds that follow ants, seeing how cues about food, what we're assuming is food, is really determining who's coming into these foraging aggregations of birds that follow army ants. Army ants scour the forest floor. They stir up all these insects, and these birds are jockeying for position to pluck off the insects as the front moves along. Well, there's all these dynamics of who's coming and following along, and so we've done some playback experiments to show that there's these different types of cues that might be relatively more important than others. Obviously, the identity of these species that are always following ant swarming birds are really important. But then the aggregation size that we've simulated in the playbacks and the diversity of species calling has some influence as well. And now we want to go along a rainfall gradient and see how those interactions through these cues might change as a function of a precipitation gradient. And then lastly, or not lastly, one other thing, well, two other things I want to talk about is looking at then how the flock, this social group I'd like to talk about, eventually think about how this social group is part of this trophic cascade. This is 10, 15, 20 year long project obviously, but thinking of using metamarketing from diet to see where these flocks fit as a social unit into trophic cascade, into food webs. And then lastly, we did this, we revisited the Cocha Cashew 100 hectare plot, which is a 100 hectare plot in southeastern Peru, where it's relatively there's no anthropogenic disturbance. And Scott Robinson and John Turkworth and Charlie Munn and a bunch of others went back here and surveyed this plot in 1983 and described the entire structural organization of the community. And a lot of work has come out, some work has come out of that, looking at how some communities are assembled. And we went back, got some money to go back there and resurvey this across a few generations. We had a huge crew doing that, and so we resurveyed this area. What we wanted to, of course, is do some just temporal comparisons of how the community has changed, because it's incredibly hard to do. And as an example of that, here are some of the original plots from 1982. Here are the spot mapping maps from John Turkworth, and then we've redone the data and looked at these maps, but these maps are very subjective in a lot of ways. So they're prone to a lot of error, so we're trying to average a couple of different people doing them. But one, a little less objective way is we're trying to look at change, right? The idea is to look at change across species. So we're doing kernel density estimation based upon just points to try and see how the distribution of the species might have changed across the plot over time. And to do that, we might be able to couple with some other things that can make inferences about the abundances of the species on the plot. And what I think would be really interesting then is to think about some of these traits about social information and see how some of these, how social information might explain some of the clustering, not just the over-dispersion that you might expect from competition. So it'd be really interesting to put both of those things together, and that's what we're working towards in that sense. And then, of course, I want to thank all the amazing field assistants I've had. As many of you know, field work is very hard wherever we go, and I'd like to thank all the funding sources. And also, on top of all that, it's not just slave labor, of course. A lot of these folks have gone on to do work. We've got a couple master's projects, and so most of these people have done some kind of publication out of it. And then we've tried to do some work with some training some undergrads in Latin America. And of course, I want to thank my mentors and all my collaborators that were present in the things I showed today. And then I want to say thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm really willing to answer them. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks for the great talk. I have a question about those two species, the similar species that have different responses to their alarm calls. So you said all else was equal, but it seemed like there was a spatial structure to where they were positioned, and I'm curious, and also it seemed like their alarm call was like different, maybe not enough, but I'm curious to see if there's anything about the habitat that have one species in versus the other, and so the one that maybe fewer individuals respond to is a place where you can get more personal information and rely less on that because it's more open.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I said all else equal, because there's a lot more to look at. It's a great question. Yeah, I don't know. But the areas that it's kind of hard. We've been thinking about that a lot, but it's hard because the ones that are producing more alarm calls, it seems to be denser, a little bit lower, but more open above. Yet those birds are higher up, so it's just kind of hard to develop a straightforward prediction, I think, of what we'd expect at this point. And then the other birds, yeah, I mean, we have thought about this a lot. And then the other thing is that the other bird that tends to be in a more open area, so you might expect it doesn't alarm call much, doesn't have as much refuge to dive into, or that's around, or the other birds don't have, it might feel more vulnerable to alarm call. Because I just want to follow up on that. The interesting thing is, the whole other thing we do with this is, we're talking about birds alarm calling, but in terms of personal safety, there's clearly, you'd expect, if you throw that fly raptor right next to the alarm calling bird, it's not going to call it off. And that happened. I was like, oh, perfect. This is a zero trial, a close trial. That the scipider is just a rocket. The thing does not, it just flew right through, right next to where I have my binocular. That thing didn't make a peep. And of course, it was like, oh my gosh, we're going to die. So there's that whole issue of what the personal risk is to the bird and whether it's going to produce alarm call. And so I think that's the way to think about it, I think. Does that answer your question? We haven't gotten to it.
And it would also, I guess follow-up would also be interesting to see other, does anyone else make alarm calls?
Yes.
Okay, so
yeah.
And then there's a difference in that?
We don't know yet. We haven't ran it. That's the whole other, yeah, we have that data. But right, that's the other thing. So how was that other network happening, right, given what the habitats that were in is happening? Okay. Yeah.
So Robert Graff, just like this week, published a paper showing that heterospecifics are responding within like 100 milliseconds, you know, before they can sort of assess the whole caller identity, basically, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just wondering, do you see some species responding sooner than others? Because we
oh gosh, that's a great question. We haven't even looked at that yet. I don't know if you noticed, but as soon as you play, like, as soon as the sound
waited, but the other bird
immediately. Yeah, exactly. And so what we are, we don't know, but what we have another paper where we're actually looking at, from the flip side, the variance of the alarm calls. So I think it also depends on the type of alarm call that's being produced. So we just hit the surface with a number of urgent nodes, but now what Jose Miguel is doing has tried to do this modeling, look at the accumulation of sound frequency of the alarm over time, and we see a very different pattern, and so that clearly would influence, I think, what the response would be. So that's one side of the equation. The other side is what you said. How quickly are birds responding? We have not looked at that. Yeah. So, and yeah, that's another
rich patch.
Yeah, rich patch, exactly. Yes.
You measured the birds' territories
yes.
After 20 years of French Guiana, and you showed that the territories really didn't change much in that period. Can you conclude that the habitat didn't change much as well?
We did not measure habitat, but we do not think so. And what we posit is that one of the things we might think of stability, one of the things that might lead to stable territoriality is the fact that your territory is larger than the localized disturbances other than like a wind throw. So, in other words, you have tree fall gaps, and the tree fall gaps, I forgot what the size of the average tree fall gap is, but it's much smaller than the 6 to 9 hectares of territory. So we hypothesize that it's the size of the territory that can observe these small disturbances that allows the birds to shift around. So our prediction for that would be that you would expect smaller territories to shift much more. And so that's where our predictions are. Yeah. I'm sorry, yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, it seems like these alarm callers are kind of a central component, and then these other elements of the flock are kind of aggregating around them.
Yeah.
Do the alarm callers benefit from their association with these other birds in the flock in some way?
Yes. Yeah, well, one does and one does not. I think it's interesting. Like, if I were to speculate, I would say one's definitely a mutualism because one of them kleptoparasitizes the other birds, and then the other one is like a commensalism parasitism. But going back, but the problem with the whole flocking literature is actually quantifying the cost and benefits of that is super hard, and so I'm very hesitant. I mean, most of us that do this work kind of say, well, they're there, and so therefore there must be some net benefit, which I'm not sure is the safest way to think about it, but that's what most people do. And in terms of that, yes, so there's a classic paper that looked at whether some of these birds have developed false alarm calls, right? If you're thinking about it from trying to cheat. And we haven't been able to verify it. It was a classic study that was done. But some people have shown that other systems. Ben Flower's work shows that there's alarm calls, at least mimicking alarm calls for other species of like other birds. So there is, but I will tell you for sure, benefiting for sure. You see some of these guys, that one bird that I told you that does benefit from alarm calls. One of the graph I did a comparison where you look at the nearest neighbors, and the one that's the one that doesn't produce a lot of alarm calls has neighbors. If you were to do like, when I mean by nearest neighbor, like the orientation on the clock. So I quantify the amount of time the neighbor was at a different orientation, and it's all over the place. The other one though, that's the really good alarm caller, the orientation of the other bird that's closest by is always 10 to 1. So it's always above them. And when you look, it's beautiful to see these guys are in the forest, and you see they're looking up because there's someone above them. And sure enough, there's some bird rummaging around above. And a lot of times I've seen, if they drop or thought that they drop something, they're right there to pick it up. And I've even seen them go all the way out and steal something, like 10 meters. They'll see one of those little ant shrikes in the vine tail, and they'll just go out horizontally 10 meters to come back and just take a food out of it. So that happens for sure. So they are benefiting on one group, and the other group I wouldn't be able to say, but it hasn't been quantified really well. Yeah. Yes.
So the way you described it, it doesn't seem like it's possible, but when you describe the territories, the flocks on them, and how the birds would sing and counter-sing to their own species,
yeah.
Do you see interactions between the species there?
Yeah.
Describe it as cooperative territory defense or not?
Yeah, that's a really cool thing. I don't know, but all I can tell you that we have seen, they definitely, that's a playback experiment that we haven't published, but where we actually show, I call it the guilt by association hypothesis. So if you play species B, A can respond a lot more. And I think it's just because they know that that bee is associated with the other flock. And so, yeah, that much I can't say. I can't say whether there's a cooperative effort, to push out the neighboring flock. Yes?
Just a sort of broader question. I'm curious, I know that there's a lot of like species of flock work being done in South America. Do these sort of highly technically cooperative flocks exist in other, I know that they're not really a factor here, but do they also show up in other tropical areas? Or is this like a tropical phenomenon? Is this a South America, Amazon phenomenon?
Evan Goodale will tell you it doesn't happen, and who's done a lot of this work. He's the one who's done all the work in Asia, a lot of the work in Asia. And he says, these birds just don't come and they fight against each other. But that doesn't mean that there's not these stable territories. Everyone I've talked, I had field assistants of mine who've worked with Tom Martin, have gone to Indonesia, they've looked for it, and they said they haven't seen it. We don't know, is the bottom line of it, I'm sorry to say. However, you say, obviously it doesn't happen here, I'm not so sure. I've talked to some people in Carolina with the wintering flocks, chickadees, they say it doesn't happen. But if you look at some of Alatalo's old work, or not Alatalo, there's a Finn, where they study, or not a Finn, I'm sorry, there was a Swedish researcher who did work back in the 80s, looking at the wintering flocks and actually wanted to see how species invaded this disappearing territory. And he had 4 flocks mapped of I think willowtits from 1981, and then he had them drawn in 1982 because he wanted to show how the one territory disappeared and what happened to it. The other 3 were identical from one year to the next. So I just don't know if anyone's looked at it because I don't know how many people want to follow around stuff in winter. But yeah, I'm not so sure it does not happen. So I think that we don't, I would say we don't know. I think there's just a sampling bias in terms of no one, these studies that were originally done to find this out, people spent like a year in the field because people don't do that. But I think it could definitely happen. The last thing I will say is that John Turgor said Cameroon doesn't happen because in Cameroon, elephants trump from the understory, there's no understory, so things just kind of come and go. But I just talked to a graduate student in Illinois who says that, or Chicago, who said that there are parts of Cameroon where it is, you do have some vegetation, so we don't know. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but I don't know. We don't know. So, great. Cool, well, thank you very much.